Okay, picture this. You're at Dulles Airport. Suddenly there's this group arriving, maybe 49, maybe 59 people. Reports vary a bit. And they're waving American flags.
Right.
But the thing that really catches your eye is who they are. White South Africans. And they've just been granted refugee status by the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm. Quite an unusual sight.
Exactly. So let's unpack this. What exactly was going on here? How did this happen?
Well, it's a really fascinating point where, specific rhetoric meets actual policy. You had the U.S. administration at the time making a very explicit offer of refuge
To this specific group.
to this specific group, yeah, based on claims they were facing racial persecution. And, well, it definitely stirred up a lot of debate,
Right.
both here in the U.S. and, of course, in South Africa.
Right. So that's our goal for this deep dive, really understanding the why behind it all.
Yeah.
We've looked at reports from The Guardian, BBC News, CNN. They all covered this, the controversy surrounding
It's
it.
a significant amount of controversy.
Yeah. We want to get past the headlines, look at the motivations, the different reactions, the bigger picture. It's complex. Lots of layers here.
Absolutely. And it's more than just a news story, isn't it? It touches on really fundamental questions like, who counts as a refugee? What about historical injustice? Even how nations interact.
So looking at these sources should help us piece together a clearer view.
Hopefully, yes.
Okay, let's start with the U.S. side of things. One thing that really stands out is President Trump's language talking about a genocide against Afrikaners. Now, that wasn't just a one-off comment, right? It seemed connected to a far-right conspiracy theory that people like Elon Musk also amplified. Where did that narrative come from?
That's a really key piece. This idea, while it got a lot of recent airtime, kind of taps into older anxieties, and interpretations of things like crime stats, the land reform debate in South Africa.
So people point to violence against farmers.
Right. Proponents highlight incidents of violence, particularly against white farmers, and they argue the government's land policies are discriminatory, even like an existential threat to Afrikaners.
But others push back hard on that.
Oh, strongly. Opponents say these claims are inflated, that there's no real systematic evidence of a targeted genocide. It's a hugely contested narrative.
And this narrative seemed to directly shape policy. Because in February, there was an executive order. That's a direct instruction from the president, correct?
Yes, exactly. A direct order to government officials.
And it specifically told officials to grant refugee status to Afrikaners. And the justification was, let me get this right, government-sponsored race-based discrimination, including racially discriminatory property confiscation.
That specific wording is crucial. It frames the whole rationale. They're explicitly tying South Africa's land reform policies to racial discrimination and using that as the basis for offering refugee status.
And the arrival itself, you mentioned it was quite a scene.
It was. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau was actually there at Dulles to meet them. He even mentioned his own family history, fleeing persecution in Europe.
I'm drawing a parallel.
A very direct one. He said the U.S. rejects the egregious persecution of people on the basis of race in South Africa.
Having someone that high profile there sends a clear signal. And he also made that comment about Afrikaners being able to be easily assimilated into the U.S.
That comment raised some eyebrows.
Yeah, because you have to ask, what are the usual criteria for refugee status? It's not typically about assimilation potential, is it?
Well, no. The standard definition under international and U.S. law focuses on a well-founded fear of persecution. Persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or belonging to a particular social group. The danger in their home country is the key thing.
So talking about assimilation introduces something else entirely.
It does. Especially as you pointed out, the timing. This focus on Afrikaners was happening right when the general U.S. refugee program was basically paused for many others.
People fleeing active wars, famine.
Exactly. People in incredibly desperate situations. The sources really drive home this contrast. While this group was welcomed, you had like over 100,000 other approved refugees just stuck in limbo because of that broader suspension.
That discrepancy, that sort of selective approach, understandably drew a lot of fire from refugee advocates.
It really did. And then you had Stephen Miller, a key White House advisor then, reportedly saying this arrival was just the beginning of what's going to be a much larger scale relocation effort.
Suggesting a major policy shift was underway?
It certainly sounded like it. A potential large-scale program focused specifically on this group based on these persecution claims. And you have to remember the context, too. The U.S. was already criticizing South Africa's land reform.
Right, the Expropriation Act. the one allowing land seizure without compensation in some cases.
Yes, the U.S. administration framed that very specifically as racially discriminatory property confiscation. That was part of their argument for why these individuals needed refuge.
And even before the executive order, Trump had tweeted about inviting South African farmers, promising a rapid pathway to citizenship.
So there was a clear buildup, a pre-existing stance, a kind of open invitation almost, leading up to this formal policy action.
And just to highlight the contrast again, the very day this group arrived at Dulles, that same day the U.S. ended legal protections against deportation for Afghans. The reason given: an improved security situation back in Afghanistan.
Wow, that juxtaposition is stark. Welcoming one group citing persecution while removing protections for another, citing improved safety. It's quite something.
Okay, let's shift gears. The South African perspective. As you'd expect, very different.
Radically different, yes.
President Cyril Ramaphosa was very direct. He said he personally told Trump that the information about white South Africans being discriminated against was false.
Right. He essentially said that narrative was being pushed by people who just disagreed with the government's efforts to fix the massive racial inequalities left over from apartheid.
So, from his viewpoint, the people arriving in the U.S. weren't refugees at all.
Exactly. He stated they do not fit the definition of a refugee because, in his view and his government's view, they simply weren't being persecuted. That was the official South African stance.
And to get why they see it that way, we need that context on land reform. The sources remind us progress since apartheid ended has been really slow.
Incredibly slow. You have black South Africans making up, what, over 90% of the population?
Yep.
But as of 2017, they owned only about 4% of the privately held land. A huge imbalance.
Then the Expropriation Act was meant to tackle that imbalance.
Precisely. The South African government sees it as a vital tool, maybe a difficult one, but necessary to correct those historical wrongs of apartheid.
Yeah.
But as we saw, the U.S. interpreted that same policy very differently.
And the economic picture reinforces that inequality narrative. White South Africans, on average, have something like 20 times the wealth of black South Africans.
Yeah, and look at unemployment figures. For black South Africans, it was over 46%. For white South Africans, just over 9%. Massive gaps remain.
So these stats provide the backdrop for why the South African government is pursuing land reform, even if it's controversial. It's about addressing these deep-seated economic disparities.
It's an incredibly complex legacy, and clearly the U.S. and South Africa had fundamentally opposing views on what was actually happening and what these policies meant.
And the diplomatic friction got pretty intense. South Africa's ambassador to the U.S. was actually kicked out, wasn't he?
He was, yes. Expelled after he accused Trump of using white victimhood as a dog whistle.
Wow, that really shows how badly this strained the relationship.
Absolutely. It underscores just how deep the disagreement went. The South African government clearly felt the U.S. policy was built on, well, misinformation and harmful stereotypes.
Okay, so let's turn to the controversy itself. The criticism this sparked. Refugee advocates were pretty vocal. Laura Thompson-Asuri from Homes Not Borders said flatly, Afrikaners are not refugees. And she suggested the policy was really about welcoming people who look like us, a direct accusation of racial bias.
That really cuts to the core of the criticism, doesn't it? Challenging the very basis for refugee status in this specific case and pointing towards potentially discriminatory motives in U.S. policy.
And some politicians were equally blunt. Senator Chris Van Hollen, a Democrat, called it a global apartheid policy, an outrageous insult.
Very strong language. That highlights the deep political divide this created within the U.S. itself. Van Hollen saw it as fundamentally discriminatory, undermining the whole principle of refugee protection.
Human Rights Watch echoed that, calling it a cruel racial twist, especially, they noted, when so many others were being turned away.
Right, and faith groups also weighed in. The Episcopal Church actually stopped its refugee resettlement work with the U.S. government over this.
They did. Why?
They cited this preferential treatment for Afrikaners. They felt it went against their commitment to racial justice and reconciliation, so they pulled out of that long-standing partnership.
That's a pretty major step. Real statement.
It is. It shows just how strongly some organizations felt the ethical lines were crossed here. And Melissa Keeney from the International Refugee Assistance Project pointed to the, quote, hypocrisy and unequal treatment.
Especially with the main refugee programs suspended.
Exactly. Her point was, why this group, based on these claims, while thousands of others in clearly desperate need are left waiting, it highlighted that apparent inconsistency.
And Jeremy Conindike from Refugees International, he went even further. He called it a racialized immigration program masquerading as refugee resettlement.
He even questioned if anyone in that group arriving at Dulles had actually been forced to flee, suggesting it might be more about politics than genuine humanitarian need.
It's also interesting that within South Africa itself, this genocide idea is heavily disputed, even by some Afrikaners.
That's right. The author Max Dupreez, who is Afrikaner, called the persecution claims total absurdity and based on nothing.
So someone from within the community directly refuting the narrative used by the U.S. administration.
Exactly. It just shows how contested this whole picture is, even on the ground in South Africa.
The sources do mention farm murders, which is often part of this narrative. The 2024 stats showed 44 murders on farms. 8 victims were farmers.
Tragic numbers. And crime in rural areas is definitely a serious issue in South Africa.
But the key point the sources make is that the crime statistics aren't actually broken down by race.
Right. So while it's noted that most commercial farmers are white and most farm workers are black, the official data doesn't allow you to definitively say it's racially targeted violence specifically against white farmers. That lack of data is a crucial point of debate.
And finally, this whole situation didn't just affect refugee policy. It clearly damaged the U.S.-South African relationship.
Oh, undoubtedly. And it was happening alongside other tensions, like the U.S. criticism of South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ.
So another layer of complexity in their diplomatic interactions.
Definitely. These things don't happen in a vacuum. The refugee issue played out against this broader backdrop of existing disagreements.
Okay, so let's try and recap this deep dive. We looked at this specific event. White South Africans arriving in the U.S. granted refugee status under the Trump administration.
We examined the reasons given, primarily those claims of genocide and racially discriminatory land policies in South Africa.
But we also saw the intense controversy, really strong accusations of racial bias, and this fundamental clash between the U.S. and South African governments over what was actually happening.
Yeah, the key tensions really revolve around what does it mean to be a refugee? Was this policy driven by racial preference? And are white South Africans truly facing persecution that warrants international protection under the usual rules?
It leaves you with a lot to think about. This specific case really forces us to consider, how complex refugee status is today. How much do political motives shape who gets asylum?
What are the ethics of appearing to prioritize one group over countless others?
And maybe the biggest question for you, the listener, to ponder. What does this whole episode reveal about the global politics of seeking refuge and the powerful narratives that influence who we believe deserves protection and why?